Hey Rebels, my name is Matthew Barton, and I'm the host of the Rebellion Brewing Podcast. One of the most fascinating cultural waves to come out of the 1980s was the Satanic Panic. Even though I was only 6 or 7 years old at the time, I still remember friends talking about playing records backwards to hear secret messages from the devil. I remember walking into record stores and seeing the outrageous satanic imagery used by heavy metal bands, and feeling a little bit scared. Dungeons & Dragons was alleged to have secret spells for summoning demons or Lucifer himself. And my friends have told me stories about hiding their dice and their books from their disapproving parents. But it still feels so far away. The Satanic Panic seems much more like an American evangelical problem. But Saskatchewan had a Satanic Panic too. CBC's Lisa Bryn Rundle joins me today to talk about her podcast that does a deep dive into the wild rumors that launched a police investigation and tore a small community apart. So let's get into it. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. That was such a good intro. Now I'm all intimidated.
Why?
You might have to answer your own questions. That was really good.
I really loved your podcast, start to finish.
That's nice. Thank you.
How about we start from the beginning? What is it about?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it is about that broader phenomenon of Satanic Panic that does include all of those things, from the records playing backwards to Dungeons and Dragons and all the rest. But I focused in on a very particular element and on a particular story. So the story that I focused in on was set in Martensville, happened in Martensville, just north of Saskatoon. And it involved the sort of, I don't know, all the aspects of the Satanic Panic are troubling, but I would say the most troubling aspect, which had to do with often children, sometimes adults, saying that they had been sexually abused by satanic cults, sort of as part of ritual abuse.
That's really wild.
Yeah.
But until your podcast, I had never heard of this happening. How did you conceive of the story? How did you come to find out about this?
Yeah, well, like you, I think I'm probably a little bit older than you are, but I do remember from my childhood, I remember the sort of general Satanic Panic, but I specifically remember these kinds of stories about people talking about these really horrific ritualistic abuse situations. And they were reported on, on 2020, on 60 Minutes. It was real news. So I never questioned it. I just thought, oh, yet another terrible thing the world has to offer, as happens when you're growing up and learning about all the terrible things in the world. And so then it just sort of stayed in that box. The world sort of moved on. I moved on. And then it wasn't until a couple of years ago that I really pretty accidentally stumbled on the story of what happened in Martensville. But it connected to that memory, and it made me so curious about what had happened and how it had happened. And honestly, it's embarrassing to admit, but at first I was like, wait a second. So none of that stuff happened? Like I think I just hadn't ever rethought about it as an adult. And so I didn't have that moment where I was like, oh, that was part of a larger, panic that happened across. I had no idea. And it really kind of blew my mind. And it further blew my mind, I think, because the stories I had heard as a young person happened in the States. It really did. I mean, this goes to show you Canadians, we all think we're better. We're better than the Americans. But I was sort of like, what? It happened in Canada? And it didn't just happen in Martinsville. There was another case in Saskatchewan around the same time. There was a huge case in Ontario, actually a variety of different cases, but one really, really big one in Ontario. And, they were all over the place. But I think because it was such it's upsetting material, it's fraught, it's confusing, it involves people who are still in our communities and who may still be feeling very kind of confused about it themselves. It kind of has just gotten swept under the rug. So I think that's why we haven't heard of it. It's not in our school textbooks, really.
At the time it was happening, do you seem to recall people taking it at face value, that they actually thought there was a cult and Satan was at work? Like, they didn't just say, that's nonsense, get over yourselves?
I think you have to put your head back in the time, because I think it is really easy. And that was certainly, as I did the work on this, I had moments where I was like, how could anyone think this had happened? Like around sort of a very specific claim that was physically impossible or something, because there were lots of things like that. And I think, how can smart people believe this? And I mean, that became a really important question, like to actually think about that question seriously, because they were smart people and they were diligent people. I'm thinking here of, not only the children at the center of it, but their parents, all the police, the lawyers who were involved, because this became a large court case that went on, several court cases actually, that went on over a long period of time. And the media, lots of reporting in the media took it very seriously, and there wasn't a lot of critical pushback. So, stop me if I'm getting off on a tangent, but it kind of got into like the issue of, why do we believe the things that we believe? Not in a like religious kind of way, but just, when I watch the news or I read a newspaper, I admit I tend to, unless something is setting off my bullshit detector, I tend to think, oh yeah, if there are facts being presented as opposed to opinion, I think that the facts are probably facts, And I think that's just a tendency that most of us have, because it's too upsetting to think that, like, you don't have time to critically examine every piece of information that comes at you. Otherwise, you just would not be able to function. So, when all sorts of authority figures, when the news media and when law enforcement and lawyers and maybe even more importantly, people in your community, people you trust, people you know and care about, when they're all telling you things are real, I think it would take an incredible kind of certainty in the time and in the moment for someone to say, I don't think so.
Like, I remember being a kid and thinking, oh man, that's really scary, with the skulls and the knives and the sharp things. But I think back, that's like the opinions of a child with the child's perspective. But we had grown adults, and there were accusations flying around. Let's back it up a bit. What would you personally define as a satanic panic? What would be the common features of a panic?
I think it's important to lay that out, because one thing it's not is just, well, nobody saw the abuse, therefore, prove it, kid. That is like the exact opposite of what I would want anyone to take from it. So there are sort of very specific things, like all of these cases that involve, claims of ritual sexual abuse. There was almost no kind of corroborative evidence. In other words, based on what's being told to you, you'd expect there to be objects that are contaminated in some way, or you'd expect to find blood, you'd expect to find semen, you'd expect to find hair, etc. And none of those things were found. So I think that that's one clue, that as hard as it is to sort of ask questions when someone's disclosing something really terrible from a law, and as I think it kind of, as human beings, like regular people, if someone's disclosing to you, I don't know that is the right thing to do, to be like, really, show me the DNA. But for law enforcement, for the people whose jobs it is to evaluate this stuff, and for the people who have the responsibility and the tools to do that, that's a big clue. And in addition, there's just this, I don't know how to describe it, but just like this huge kind of set of fears and anxieties that were just permeating the culture. And I think that that kind of thing is really hard to see while you're in it, because it's just your life. It's just the fears of the time. But when you get some perspective on it as time passes, what we can look back now and see is that was the time when kids were going into daycare en masse for the first time. And that's scary. For all of human history, people, family took care of family. And for many people, mostly, middle-class people, suddenly more and more women are entering the workforce. That's new. And there are all these anxieties about, what does it mean that the mothers in particular are not home taking care of their children, or that it's not extended family who's taking care of children. And that sort of laid a groundwork for, oh my God, something's happening to the kids when we're not there, when strangers are taking care of them. Because many of these cases, the case in Martinsville, took place around daycare settings. Not all of them, but a whole lot of them. And I think that it, whether the particular scare was in a daycare or not, that fear that the children were in danger really permeated. And, you can go back and look at the root causes of that too. There were some really high profile kidnapping cases that just kind of put this unbelievable fear into parents. And so then you have a tendency to believe it when you start to hear horrible things, because they mirror what you've been afraid of. And it's pretty hard to then, step back and try to be uber rational, because nothing hits you in a less rational way than your children or your community's children being under threat. Like, I feel like I could turn from a completely cool cucumber into like a monster in a second if someone tries to hurt my kid. And I think that is true of many, 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 maybe most people. And I think that was also underlying all of this stuff. And we also, feel free to cut all this. I spent way too long reading about all of this stuff, so I've had many thoughts, but I do think, like, the other thing is that people were trying to reconcile with the fact of childhood sexual abuse, because that part's real. Um, it's
Like they thought it was such an evil thing, it couldn't be a normal thing unless Satan was doing it.
exactly. It's a way of trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense, you know? And, um, it was relatively new that as a culture, we acknowledged the fact that there was any kind of abuse of children, physical abuse or neglect or anything like that, and b that there was sexual abuse. And it had sort of, in the 80s when all this was happening, the message was sort of starting to get out that it wasn't strangers who were perpetrating crimes against children, as again people kind of wanted to believe at first. Um, Not that there were never strangers, but that by and large, the perpetrators were not strangers. They were people the child knew. Um, Now, if you break that down further, it's people in the child's family. Like that is um, that's where the statistics take you. But I think that is such a painful reality that people kind of went to, oh yeah, it must be the people who are taking care of them in daycares.
That's I've always described that, not me myself, it was explained to me, the pain of reality being so in your face that it's like this cognitive dissonance. You have to believe something else. There has to be another explanation because the truth just hurts too much.
Yeah. And you can imagine within families, um, that, let's say, a father or an uncle or someone trusted in the family is perpetrating abuse against the children. If you're able to kind of believe that some greater force is at work and that somehow that individual person who you trusted and knew and loved is not sort of solely responsible, there's a weird comfort in that. Even though, on some level it doesn't make sense to say, "Oh, it's so much more comforting to think that the devil is using my child in a ritual." But it might relieve some of the sense of guilt and responsibility that parents have, even though, they shouldn't. The guilt and responsibility lies with perpetrators, but, it's a very complicated emotional territory, and I think that that is part of what led to this whole panic. But in addition, I I was completely blown away when I found out, like, I think I sort of had a sense of some of this more sociological stuff because, as I said, from the benefit of hindsight, you can intuit a lot of that kind of stuff. It probably doesn't come as a gigantic surprise. Um, what did come as a surprise to me was that the sort of template that all of these stories followed, this idea of there being satanic cults, this idea of sort of stealing children's innocence and using them in rituals, etc., that it all kind of came from this book that this psychiatrist in Victoria, BC wrote with a patient of his who later became his wife. Red flag number one, um, or number 18. But he counseled this woman for a very long time, believed her disclosures of satanic ritual abuse. They wrote a memoir together that was a huge hit and toured all over the place, told this story, even went to many. They were Catholic, and they felt that it was important to warn members of their church. They even went to the Vatican, and it really spread this template of a story that a whole a lot of other people latched onto.
You saying that there was a book, there was a template, there was a framework for people to latch onto is really blowing my mind, because when I was in university, we studied the Salem witch trials. We studied what happened in England, then the Spanish Inquisition, and they had a book, the Malus Maleficarum. They had men whose specialized jobs were to travel from town to town with their tools, with their measurements, and they would extract confessions through torture. And they had this cycle where they would basically have a ledger, write down all the costs to the townspeople that they had incurred through the trials, down to like the penny and the shilling and the half shilling. And once the town became so fed up with the cost of having the witch trials and the burnings, that was when they said, "Get out of our town. We're not accepting you." But until then, they were gripped in fear. And I'm just seeing a lot of parallels where the authorities, the state is authorized by the people through their fear to administer this justice. And it can be really, it destroys the people who are the targets of the fear, the people who are suspected of being the witches, the satanic cultists, the daycare providers.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It's strange to see you. Not strange. It's remarkable to me to see that you've identified this pattern, which literally 15 years ago I was reading about England and Salem.
It's really disturbing. As you would like to think that we had evolved or learned from these things and whatnot. I mean, that's actually part of the reason why I feel like it's so important to acknowledge that if this were happening today, you and I would probably believe it. I don't know. You may be a more skeptical person than I am. But none of the people I talked to who were a part of it, not that I talked to everyone, but not a single person struck me as anything but, kind, logical, wanting to do the right thing by children. The easy explanation of what? There's no way, it's not helpful, because I feel like it's much more helpful to realize, oh yeah, this can and does happen. It happens to lesser extents all the time in terms of kind of stuff we believe that turns out not to be true. What differentiates this kind of thing is the power of the state to inflict punishments and ruin people's reputation. I mean, people's reputations can be ruined in other ways, but when all these mechanisms of the state are on board and aligned against you, pretty hard to fight it. And that should scare everyone, because I don't think there's any reason to think that couldn't happen again. And the better we understand how these things happen, the faster we may be able to identify them as they're beginning.
I love that you just said that, because the thought in my mind was, a very smart friend of mine says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Nice.
And when you say that, I'm like, my next question is, do you think it could happen again?
Yeah, for reals, completely. I mean, I hope that in terms of, I asked several people that question myself, and people in this particular area. I talked to a guy who worked at the FBI for a long time and whose specialty was this stuff. And he said, look, we know better now. We know how to interview children. We know how to watch for this stuff. In these cases, the questions were leading. And it's sort of a complicated reason why, but in part it's because parents were freaked out, and so they were asking their kids about it. and all sorts of other reasons, lack of training and just lack of understanding amongst some of the counselors and police officers who were doing the interviewing, about kind of just the coercion that's just naturally there when an adult is asking a child the same question over and over again. You don't have to say you're going to be in trouble if you don't do this in order for the child to start eventually making things up in order to please you. So that's now understood, sort of scientifically proven, but it wasn't very well known back then. Although there was some evidence about that, it wasn't as widely understood as it is now. And as many people I talked to who were in some way involved in the Martensville case said to me, like, we didn't have the internet. Like, we couldn't fact check things or access resources or kind of realize that we were all following the same pattern. It just wasn't like that. Like, now you could debunk something in 30 seconds online if you choose to, although you can also have your worst fears confirmed online too. But yeah, so I think that it definitely can happen again. I think it happens in these smaller ways all the time, and that we did learn, I think, as a culture, very specifically about interviewing children and that kind of thing. But if you think of it as more broadly as our fears getting tapped into, and then these kind of stories permeating that tap into those fears, then yeah, of course, that's happening all the time. Pizzagate has come back. I was just reading about that the other day. Are you familiar with the whole Pizzagate thing?
It's the dumbest
It's
thing.
back! Anyway.
How? It's so dumb. It's so dumb.
Yeah, I mean, it's not about Hillary Clinton anymore, but yeah, no, it's just, it's
Is it related to Epstein?
Apparently it's permeating on TikTok now. I'm like, I thought that was just about dancing and fun stuff. Anyway.
We know we can't, fix the lizard brain in our head. We're going to, if we know this is going to happen again, and we look at the institutions, the tools, the mechanisms, whether it's police or courts, was there any insight or learning that you had to say, oh, we can stop this before it happens again, or maybe we can protect people better?
Well, one thing is, I think, talking about it. So I'm hoping that my podcast, talking to you, all these kinds of things, I hope that that's helpful, because I do feel like the more we understand that there can be such a thing as mass hysteria and how that might play out, the better we are placed to kind of deal with it in some way and stop it sooner. What was the question again? See, I've had 4 sips of beer and now I can't follow the train of thought.
I was thinking about the institutions of our society, whether it's police or courts, and have they learned or adapted or changed?
Well, I think one of the things that I learned is that, this sounds pat, but the institutions are only as good as the people. And that, if this had landed on the plate of a different prosecutor, maybe, or, I mean, it could have played out differently. But I also do think the system as a whole should own up to its mistakes, because it is the people who can help hold the institutions to account. And if, I don't know, I feel like it would have been helpful both on that level, for that institutional learning that you're talking about, but also on the level of healing. Because, I mean, one of the biggest things I was struck by was just how much emotional wreckage there was from all of this. That's like, this is not in the past. I don't feel like I talked to a single person who sort of felt like it was solidly in the past and that they were solidly healed from it. Like, and part of the reason that's the case, in my opinion, is that there aren't agreed upon facts. The state didn't say, oh, these are the ways that we messed up, or here's what really happened. Some of the court cases failed right away to get convictions. Others, there were convictions that were then overturned on appeal. But I don't think your average person has a sense of whether or not that means they just didn't have enough evidence, but the people really did it. Or, I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, and I don't think you can generalize. It really depends on the case. And sometimes appeals are based on errors in law. That's a very common thing. So it's easy to think, oh yeah, that person was really guilty, but the court had to find them, had to let them go because of this, that, and the other thing. That was not the case in this case, I should point out. But anyway, I just think that it's until there are sort of agreed upon facts, people can't move on, institutions can't learn, because you can't kind of put together a package and say, so here's what happened, here's what we now know, and here's why, and here's how it should change. Like, none of that happened. And I find that problematic.
Does it ever happen?
No. No, but it should. It should. There should have been a public inquiry. I mean, one of the other things that I found, I mean, some people maybe would rightly point out that lots of public inquiries happen, and then the magical learning that I'm thinking of does not appear. But at least you have half a chance in hell if you do that. I think on an emotional level, I feel like it would have been really useful. And I really was quite blown away by the fact that, you know, there were people who made this their expertise, and they came around and gave workshops about how to recognize satanic ritual abuse. And, you know, the government of Saskatchewan hosted a couple of those, as did other provincial governments.
Really?
So literally, you've got the government thinking, oh my gosh, there's this emerging threat towards children. We'd better get our social workers and our law enforcement and our prosecutors like educated about this pernicious new kind of abuse. And in a way, that's great. And I've never seen governments move so quickly on issues before, but they all did, or many of them did. But yeah, there were two of these gigantic seminars. Apparently they were really the hot ticket. One of them was at the Saskatoon Inn, I recall someone telling me. And then of course, like, again, like, it's harder to point fingers at individuals when, as a institution, they're being told, here, this thing exists, and this is what you're looking for, and whatnot. So I mean, I feel like at minimum, a public inquiry would sort of make it clear that was where the seed got planted in Saskatoon area. And there were after that, there were these two different huge cases, you know, with lots and lots of lives really, really torn apart. That's it was really very damaging.
This has been really, really heavy.
I'm sorry.
So why don't we get to a little bit of the fun part of the podcast?
Okay.
I wanted to talk to you about beer's connection to Satan and witchcraft.
What? I have nothing to say about that.
But I do.
Is there a connection?
Oh, yes.
Okay, you tell me.
100%. So today I'm drinking Beach Life. It's a classic German Kolsch. It's a style. We can't technically call it a Kolsch because it doesn't come from the region in Germany because we brewed it here.
Oh, it's like a champagne situation?
Right. But we call it a Kolsch style with the finger quotes. One of the interesting things about beer's history.
Have you ever tried to say Kolschisch? Kolschesk?
Kolsch-esque? Yeah. One of the interesting things about the history of beer was it was originally the province of women. Women were the first original brewers. They took care of the hearth and home, and they were the ones who minded the pots that required the boil for the mash. People didn't understand the fermentation process. They didn't understand germ theory or the biology and chemistry of beer. So it was originally handled by women, and they had often their magic special spoon that they knew if they stirred it in the mash, it would make the beer taste better. They didn't understand that they were transferring.
Because it had yeast on it, or?
Right. So they knew if they washed the spoon, it would lose its magical properties to create beer. So they had their magical do not wash the spoon. And one of the great things about witches is the tall, long hats were originally a marketing ploy, a marketing technique. So you could spot the woman in the crowd who was selling beer. In the town, you would go and you'd be at market picking up your bread and your fruit and your meat products. And the lady with the tall, long, pointy hat had the beer.
Wow.
And one of the cool things was they had developed these recipes, potions, spells, right? You know, oh, you're intoxicating people. And they didn't quite understand the nature of intoxication. They knew it felt good. They knew drinking was this thing that they could enjoy. And as people got more efficient at brewing, the alcohol content would rise. So you could get more potent beverages. You could drink less but get more intoxicated. And one of the interesting pieces is that women were ostracized out of the profession, similar to midwifery, by men who wanted to take over and control the brewing industry. So when we see witches today, it was through the church that women were ostracized. They said witches are in league with the devil. They have magical spells which belong to Satan or dark forces. So they would drive women out of the profession of brewing by associating them with witchcraft and Satanism. And we've forgotten this.
That's amazing.
It's wild, right? It's so unfair.
It's really, I'm so glad you're telling me all this. That's fantastic.
One of the other interesting things is the most storied, fabled, longest running brewers in Europe are monks. They still finance the activities of their monastery by brewing today. Their Trappists are the most famous.
Thank you.
I had to find a connection between beer and Satanism.
I don't know how you did that, but that's amazing. That's great.
So tell me about the beer you're drinking.
Well, I can tell you very little. It's called Cherry Bee. It's cherry-ish. I tried to, because I'm not a huge beer person, I tried to get something more, you know, that kind of juice beer marriage thing, because that I can do. It's very good. It's by a microbrewery that's very close to my house, although not the closest one to my house. This one's called Burdock.
Nice.
And I'm not allowed to endorse any product. So I do not endorse it, but I'm just telling you about it. But it tastes good.
We just launched a watermelon beer for people like you.
What do you call us behind our backs?
People who don't like beer. It's not a pejorative. I usually call it the craft beer journey, where I say, we'll find a beer for you. And there's plenty of options and varieties. We just launched this watermelon beer. It's crazy. We pulled all our advertising. We pulled all our mentions of it because it went so fast and so viral. We're just like, we can't afford to spend money on this if it's selling out already.
Right. Wow.
Like, why advertise the thing that people already bought in full?
Well, now that you've caught me with the whole witches brew situation, now I feel like it's my feminist responsibility to drink beer. So I will have to get on that.
One of our brewmasters, Vanessa Owen, she's a rock star. I interviewed her on last week's episode of the podcast, and she's just fantastic. She's a wealth of knowledge. I always want to know her opinion when it comes to brewing, because this is a medical scientific fact. Women are better at tasting than men.
Why?
There's something biological going on. Your noses work better. Your palate works better. You can learn and you can train yourself, but like my wife, her sense of smell and taste outstrip mine. It's not even close. She can pick out flavors and aromas, and I'm like, oh, I don't know.
I feel like that is not true of me, except while I was pregnant, in which case I could smell like a tiny bad smell that was 8 blocks away, and it would torture me, but only for a small period of time. Thank goodness.
And that's a studied known fact as well, as a self-defense mechanism for pregnant mothers who need to get away from danger.
And who need to understand all the notes in their craft beer.
Right.
Oh, dear.
I want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Does Vanessa have her own special don't wash it spoon?
We have very specific cultures of yeast that we babysit, and we do our very best to manage them. And we have help with chemists and labs now, and it's next level. It's not pie in the sky.
It's not like the sourdough starter in my fridge that every once in a while we throw some stuff at.
You could do a sourdough beer or a sourdough
Really?
bread with beer, as long as it's not pasteurized.
You're just blowing my mind on everything. Thank you very much.
It was great having you. I feel like I learned so much.
I feel like I have no idea if I explained anything properly or not. It's like, I don't know a lot about many things, but I know too much about this one thing, and then I can never pick one thing to say. So.
I thought it was a fantastic story.
Oh, good.
I loved listening to the podcast start to finish. It was a really great piece of professionalism.
This is me weeping. Thank you.
Rebels, thanks for listening today. If you have any questions about this episode, be sure to join us on our brand new Facebook group page of the Rebellion Brewing Podcast. I'm going to include links in the show notes so you can find Lisa's podcast on the CBC Uncover page. As you know, we are proud to be affiliate members of the Saskatchewan Podcast Network. If you're looking for more great shows, be sure to hop on the network and check out all the new episodes coming out. That's local people producing local stories. As you know, the Sask Craft Beer scene is always changing, and I'm going to do my best to keep featuring all the new local beers coming out. And thank you for joining the Rebellion.